Close your eyes and take a deep breath. Today I invite you into a legend where love was measured by what one heart was willing to surrender for another. Within the quiet halls of Pherae, a choice would be made that no family could ever forget. And from that moment on, every prayer, every silence, and every glance would carry the weight of what had been given up. Yet this was never only the story of sorrow. It was also the story of a bond so deep that even the darkest turning of fate could not easily erase it. As the palace stood beneath the shadow of loss, unseen hands began to move. Old promises returned, and a moment approached that would test devotion, guilt, and love in ways no one inside those walls could have imagined. Before we begin this epic, I have a small request that means a lot to me. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. The greatest reward for all the effort I put into creating these epics is your support through subscribing to my channel. If you enjoy my content and want me to continue creating more, your subscription and like truly give me great motivation. Also, don't forget to share your thoughts with me in the comments. Your comments not only encourage me, but also help me understand what kind of epics and stories you would like to see on this channel. Thank you so much in advance for your support. Take a deep breath, relax your mind, and let the rhythm of this ancient legend guide you, wishing you a peaceful sleep. The epic of Alcestis, She Gave Up Everything for Her Husband, begins now. For Apollo, everything began on that ominous day when the bright order of the heavens broke apart and turned into an irreversible law. His son Asclepios, famed for his knowledge of healing, had gone so far that he challenged the greatest fear of mortals and drew near the harsh boundary between life and death that the gods had set. Zeus did not allow that excess, which would have shaken the balance of the universe, and he cast down his thunderbolt, restoring order by his own command. Asclepios's fall awakened in Apollo not only anger, but also a father's grief so heavy that even the gods felt its weight. The god who ruled light and harmony lost the calm of music that day. The mourning within him drove him to act without thought. He found the Cyclopes who forged Zeus's thunderbolts and turned his arrows on them, and what he did was not merely retaliation, but open defiance aimed at the command of Olympus. Thus, Apollo, for the first time, entered a rage too heavy for him to carry with his own light. The radiant god of the heavens had come up against the limit of his own power in the darkness of his grief. Zeus regarded the fall of the Cyclopes not merely as a crime, but as a blow struck at the heart of divine order. In his anger, he considered sending Apollo into endless darkness, yet Leto's pleading and the reluctance even among the gods to see Apollo's light extinguished completely turned the punishment into another form. Apollo would descend among mortals, live for 1 year under the command of a human being, and taste in his own existence the weariness of the earth and the limits of the body. What humiliated him most was not only service itself, but the fact that he would, for the first time, feel directly how hunger, exhaustion, and the passage of time worked upon a human being. Though the wind still stirred his golden hair, he was no longer the god who moved by splitting the sky. He was an exile who walked dusty roads and had to lower his gaze to the ground. In that way, Zeus delivered punishment not with chains, but with experience. He sent Apollo to Pherae in Thessaly, to the palace of the young king Admetos, and for the god, that new life began not with divine splendor, but with the measure of the human heart. When he arrived in Pherae, Apollo bore none of the glory that would have revealed his light. He wore rough clothing, his hair had dulled with the dust of the road, and the silent shadow of strangeness had settled over his face. Yet the moment Admetos first saw him, he sensed that the man before him was no ordinary person. He felt it not through a sign, but through the measured nobility his presence carried. Even so, he asked no questions, showed no superiority, and did not hold back in suspicion. He stood less like a king receiving someone at his gate than like a host who knew how to honor a guest entering his home. That day, Admetos showed the stranger a place, opened his table to him, told him to rest, and treated him not like a slave but like an honorable guest. For Apollo, that manner was unexpected, because on Olympos, power gave rise to obedience, and mortals most often bowed in fear. Here, however, a young king had shown respect to a stranger whose identity he did not know simply because he was human. Apollo's fierce grief eased for the first time that evening, and the heaviest part of his exile suddenly turned into a silence he could endure. When Admetos placed him over the herds, Apollo met the true face of his punishment in the meadows of Pherae. The hands that had once silenced gods with the lyre now leaned on a staff, watched the water paths, and guided the animals toward the shaded ground. Yet within those daily tasks, there was an entirely different stillness. When Apollo went out to the pastures in the cool hours of morning, even the wind seemed to blow more gently around him. The melodies that flowed from his pipe gathered the herds, calmed the skittish animals, and seemed to dissolve the invisible tension resting over the earth. Before long, an extraordinary abundance appeared in Pherae. The herds multiplied, cows bore twin calves, and the crops showed a generosity beyond what the season had promised. Admetos did not proclaim it as a miracle. He merely saw that after the arrival of the foreign shepherd, the land had changed, the air had grown fruitful, and life around the palace had begun to move in an unfamiliar harmony. Apollo, for his part, continued his work without any display of pride. In those days he did not display divine power, but simply let the natural weight of his presence settle over the land. As time passed, the bond between Apollo and Admetos quietly moved beyond the boundary between master and servant. Admetos did more than trust this stranger to whom he had entrusted his herds. He listened to him without contempt, made room for him at the table, and spoke with him through long evenings. For a king, that kind of grace was not ordinary, because most rulers never saw the hand that served, but only the result of the service. Admetos did the opposite. He noticed Apollo's weariness, felt the weight inside his silence, and made him part of the household. Apollo, in that closeness, learned the fragility of a mortal man, but also his nobility. Admetos's justice lived not only in the courts, but also in his daily conduct. In his presence, the people of the palace felt more measured, more peaceful, and more secure. For that reason, what Apollo found in Pherae was not merely a refuge, but an order built through labor and goodness. The god who had been accustomed to command on Olympos saw here that respect was born not from fear, but from character, and the closeness he felt toward Admetos quietly turned into loyalty. At a certain point, the abundance in Pherae grew too great to be explained only by good seasons. The rivers flowed steadily, the grazing lands did not know drought, and even the wild beasts that approached the herds turned away from their usual nature. One day, as Admetos watched his foreign shepherd near the edge of the pastures, he fell silent for a long time before the order surrounding him. Even the most restless creatures of the wild lost their aggression in Apollo's presence, calming as if they obeyed an unseen command. In that moment, the king fully understood that the man before him could not be explained by ordinary fortune. Even so, he did not try to force the truth into the open. He was a man who knew that the way to approach the sacred was through measure, not through rudeness. That attitude affected Apollo even more, because even if Admetos had sensed something divine, he had not tried to claim it, use it, or learn its name so he could boast of it. He simply felt gratitude, acted with kindness, and shared the abundance offered to him with his people. Thus, Pherae became not only a kingdom that grew rich, but also the place where a god learned to respect human virtue. Toward the end of the year of exile, the veil of mortality over Apollo began to grow thin. The depth in his gaze could no longer be hidden, and the measure in his bearing turned with each passing day into a more visible power. Admetos noticed this as well, but still remained silent. On one of the final days, as the sun slowly descended behind the walls of Pherae, Apollo came into the king's presence. This time, his voice was no longer the voice of a shepherd, though it still carried the warmth of friendship. Admetos understood with certainty that the one standing before him was no ordinary man, and he drew back by instinct. But Apollo did not want him to bow in fear. He reminded him, one by one, of the hospitality he had shown, the honor he had offered to a stranger, and the respect he had never withheld throughout the exile. He said that a king's nobility was revealed not in his crown, but in how he treated someone he did not know. When Admetos learned that the one who had lived beside him for months was the Lord of the Sun and of Song, he felt not only astonishment, but also a deep embarrassment. Yet there was no judgment in Apollo's eyes. There was only a rare admiration for the human heart. Before Apollo departed, he did not leave Admetos's house behind with an empty blessing. He said that the abundance he had brought to Pherae would continue, and that this household would remain for some time under an unseen protection. But the promise he gave was heavier than abundance and more dangerous than friendship. He whispered to Admetos that when death one day knocked at his door, his path would not be closed completely, and that before fate a way out would arise for him. This was not a promise of victory, but a vow whose price would only be understood later. In that moment, Admetos could not grasp its depth. He only thought that Apollo, in the name of friendship, had left him an unforgettable gift. As the god returned to the sky, the evening light deepened over Pherae. The sound of bells drifting from the meadows kept its old rhythm, and the people of the palace believed only that the fruitful days would continue. Yet after that evening, Admetos was no longer an ordinary king. His life had been bound, invisibly, to the harsh threads of fate. The exile of light had ended, but the true story had only just begun on its long road, one that would test how far friendship could go against death. After Apollo left Pherae, the kingdom's abundance did not fade. Yet within Admetus, a void he had never before been able to name began to grow. The land was fertile, the herds kept multiplying, and the people were pleased with his justice. Still, the young king felt that his life should not remain nothing more than a well-governed reign. In those days, the name of Alcestis, daughter of Peleus, king of Iolcus, was spoken throughout all of Hellas, for her beauty, her dignity, and her measured character. Those who heard of her spoke not only of her face but of her conduct, saying that when she entered a palace, she brought not display, but peace, as one of those rare women who carried calm wherever they went. When Admetus first heard these accounts, something deeper than a passing desire stirred within him. Even before he saw Alcestis, he sensed that a union with her would not be an ordinary marriage. For that reason, the road to Iolcus became more than the path of a suitor for him. After Apollo's friendship, it became the second great gate that fate had opened before him, and Admetus walked toward that threshold not with fear, but with grave resolve. When he arrived in Iolcus, the palace of Peleus resembled a place of trial from the very gate. The king was old, suspicious, and determined that the men who sought his daughter's hand should prove not only their nobility or their wealth, but a resolve that could be measured against the gods themselves. For that reason, the condition he set before the suitors was considered nearly impossible. The man who would marry Alcestis had to yoke a savage lion and a raging wild boar to the same chariot and drive those two creatures under a single harness into the square of Iolcus. The condition required more than strength. It demanded resistance against the order of nature itself, the binding of two hostile forces to one will. Many warriors had heard that challenge before, but they had turned back without fulfilling it. When Admetus heard the words, he fell into a brief silence. He understood that what was being asked could not be accomplished by human power alone, yet he did not surrender to despair. In the meadows of Pherae, he had seen with his own eyes how that old friend who once carried a shepherd's staff had softened what was wild with music. That night, Admetus called upon Apollo not with grand words, but only with a sincere heart. He said that he had not forgotten the friendship shown to him in Pherae, and that if the gods still considered him worthy of his favor, he needed his help now. This plea was not commanding. It carried less the voice of a king giving orders than the humble call of a friend who remembered his debt of gratitude. At dawn, the direction of the wind shifted. The silence of the fields filled with a familiar stillness, and Admetus felt himself surrounded by an unseen but unshakable support. When the two beasts, whom even hunters hesitated to approach, were brought before him, the chaos everyone expected did not come. The lion's powerful body tensed, the wild boar clawed at the earth, yet some invisible melody slowly unraveled their fury. When Admetus took the reins in his hand trembled, but his will did not break. When the creatures lowered their heads and were yoked to the same chariot, the people of Iolcus fell into silence. In that moment, everyone understood that before them stood not only a brave king, but a man upheld by divine favor. When Admetus drove the chariot into the square of Iolcus, the suspicion on Peleus's face gave way to unwilling amazement. The two creatures, which had been expected to tear each other apart, moved at the same pace as if they had long been accustomed to the same command. The sight was not a sign of brute force, but of a higher order. Peleus could not turn back from his word, and he agreed to give Alcestis's hand to Admetus. Yet the true weight of that moment lay not in the crowd gathered in the square, but in the gaze of the young woman standing on the high steps of the palace. Alcestis studied this king who had come for her, not only because of what he had achieved, but because of the way he bore it. There was no pride in Admetus. He did not lose himself in the intoxication of victory, nor did he present what he had done as a spectacle. It was as though he knew that what he had accomplished had come less from his own hand than from a goodness greater than himself. Trust was born in Alcestis's heart at that very point, for she had seen not a man who strained the world to possess her, but a man who did not lose his measure even after passing through the impossible. As the wedding preparations began, the joy of the two households turned into more than the celebration of a political union. It became the happiness of two harmonious characters coming together. The envoys from Pherae spoke of Admetus's goodness. Those in Iolcus spoke of Alcestis's dignified grace, and everyone believed that this marriage was a union approved by the gods. Alcestis was a young woman who took no pleasure in quiet display. Even within the crowds of the palace, she spoke without letting her gaze scatter, and in the midst of splendor, she kept her calm. Beside her, Admetus seemed less like a ruler than like a man standing beside the peace that completed his fate. As the wedding day drew near, the palace courtyards filled with sacrificial rites, prayers, and guests. Everything followed proper form. Every step was taken according to custom. Still, the shadow of an unseen lack began to move around the edges of that joy. Great ceremonies sometimes concealed their gravest neglect at the very moment they appeared flawless, and within the brilliance of happiness, a person could be late in remembering certain debts. In those days, Admetus, swept up in the overflow of joy, did not yet notice it. When the wedding day came, fires were lit, offerings to the gods were prepared, and the palace filled with a gladness it had not seen in a long time. Yet amid the joyful rush, Admetus's attention wavered for a moment, and he neglected the portion that should have been offered to Artemis, protector of marriages, transitions, and women. This failing was not a deliberate act of disrespect, but in the world of the gods, even forgetfulness could at times be counted as a grave sign. When night fell, it was not peace, but a chilling warning that entered the chamber of the newlyweds. Along the stone floor and through the shadowed corners of the bedchamber, dark snakes appeared, coiled in silence. Their presence was not an attack so much as the visible form of divine displeasure. Alcestis froze, and Admetus felt the cold breath of death on the first night of the life whose gate he had believed victory had opened for him. Outside, the final sounds of the wedding still carried on, but inside, an entirely different silence had settled. In that moment, Admetus understood with pain that even on the happiest day of his life, a human being could not stand faultless before the gods, and that a single moment of neglect was enough to cast a shadow into the heart of joy. Rather than surrendering to fear, Admetus immediately understood his mistake and called once more to mind Apollo's old friendship. As the stories told it, the god of light had not abandoned him completely. He reached his friend as though through inspiration, showing him the words with which he should pray, the rites of purification that would soothe Artemis's anger, and the way forgotten reverence could be restored. That night, Admetus laid aside his pride and begged forgiveness. He saw that what would save his kingdom, his victory, and his new marriage was not strength, but sincere remorse. The altars were raised again, the offerings that had been left undone were completed, and the prayers rose with greater restraint and deeper reverence. Then the ominous sight in the chamber slowly withdrew. The snakes slipped back into the shadows with the same silence in which they had come. Yet the mark left by that night did not vanish. On the very first night of the home they had built, Admetus and Alcestis came to understand that it was not only a house of happiness, but a field of fate watched closely by the gods. Joy had returned, but it was no longer in its former innocence. Something fragile and difficult to name had entered it. Apollo knew that the crack left behind as Artemis's anger subsided would one day turn into a greater trial. His friendship for Admetus did not stop there, for he had decided to repay the kindness shown to a stranger in Pherae, not only with abundance, but with a privilege before death itself. So he turned toward dark and ancient paths in order to speak with the Moirai, who held the threads of fate. As the stories told it, he softened them with wine, clouded their attention with the craft of his speech, and opened an exceptional door for Admetus's life. But this favor was not without condition. The Moirai set forth the only term that would not completely shatter the balance of the universe. Admetus could be spared on the day of his death, but only if someone else willingly agreed to go down in his place. Thus, the mercy won through friendship was bound to a dark law that would require another life beneath its shadow. Apollo knew that what he had brought to Pherae was not victory, but a grave postponement. And while Admetus held Alcestis's hand after their wedding, he had no idea that what had been written into his life was not a divine gift, but a terrible trial that would one day force love and conscience to stand against each other. In the early days of Admetus and Alcestis's marriage, it seemed, from the outside, as though it had been protected by the open favor of the gods. In Pherae, the seasons arrived in order, the herds kept their abundance, and the people of the palace spoke of their king's justice and their queen's measured grace. In time, this marriage came to be remembered not only as the union of two noble houses, but as the joining of two characters who had found harmony beneath the same roof. The birth of their children brought an even deeper vitality to the palace. Admetus carried the joy of fatherhood, and Alcestis bore the heavy and sacred joy of motherhood. Yet beneath this visible peace, that old debt, which had opened the door on the wedding night, quietly remained alive. The exception Apollo had secured in the face of death had never truly been a gift, and it had remained only an account whose payment had been delayed. Even as the years passed, the condition fate had set never disappeared. At times, Admetus tried to forget this truth, but forgetting did not erase the debt. Even in the palace's joyful days, an unseen shadow remained there, and that shadow waited to strike at the very thing a person feared losing most, at the very moment when complete happiness had settled in. One day, without any battle cry being heard, without any enemy pressing against the walls and hurling threats, it became clear that the appointed day of Admetus was drawing near. This approaching end made itself felt not with a sword, but with that unnameable weight settling over body and soul. As the stories told it, Admetus noticed that life had suddenly grown thin, that even sunlight no longer gave the warmth it once had. The narrow door Apollo had once opened now truly stood before him. The opportunity the friendly god had provided now left only one condition behind. The king would live, but only if someone else willingly agreed to go down to the land of the dead in his place. This news spread through the palace not like news of a victory, but like a judgment that forced a person to face his own conscience. At first, Admetus weighed this condition only with his mind, because like every mortal who wished to preserve his life, he thought about how sweet life was, but that thought immediately brought shame behind it. A person loved his own life, yet to wish for someone else to walk into darkness in its place was a bitter desire, painful enough to stain even the heaviest prayer. At first, Admetus sought the natural answer to this terrible condition within his own family. In his mind, his mother and father, who had lived their years, whose hair had turned grey, and who had tasted the light of day for so long, might consider descending in his place. In the eyes of today, this thought might have seemed harsh, but in the order of the ancient world, the continuation of the household through the son, the children not being left fatherless, and the preservation of a young king's life were not reasons to be taken lightly. For that very reason, without feeling entirely cruel, yet still unable to feel true peace, Admetus turned to his father Pherae and to his mother. He told them of the throne, the household, their grandchildren, and the approaching disaster. He said that in his death, not only one man, but an entire order would collapse. His words moved back and forth between pleading and justification, because deep inside he did not want to think they might refuse. For the door Apollo had opened to be truly usable, someone had to say yes, and for that moment, Admetus believed that answer would come from those closest to him. But a person could be generous while death remained a thought that belonged to someone else, and could become someone entirely different when it came and stood at his own door. Pherae listened to his son, but he spoke not with the slowness old age had brought him, but with complete clarity and resolve. He said that life, however short, still seemed sweet to a person, and that seeing the light of day remained something no one wished to give up until the final moment. He admitted not that he did not love his son, but that, like every human being, he also loved his own life. In his view, no one was obligated to die for another by necessity. Just as a son had not been born in his father's place, so a father could not be considered bound to descend in his son's place. This answer did more than disappoint Admetus. It also shattered the very idea of family on which he had relied since childhood. There was logic in his father's words, but no mercy. Moreover, Pherae met with hidden reproach the idea that his son expected death from an old man in order to preserve his own life. In that way, the conversation turned not into the family solidarity that had been expected, but into a harsh confrontation that showed how no person wished to surrender the share of light that had fallen to him. When Admetus left that room, he had not merely received an answer. He had learned that even the people he had believed were closest to him left him alone in the face of death. His mother did not speak differently. Her voice was gentler than his father's, but the conclusion she reached was the same. She too said that she was not ready to give up life, and that even if a person had come near the end of his years, he still wished to see the sun until his final breath. A mother's love did not prove strong enough to sacrifice her own life in silence. This second refusal nearly extinguished the hope inside Admetus completely. As a king, many people stood around him. He had heard words of loyalty, seen displays of friendship, and listened to vows of devotion at feasts. But once the name of death was spoken openly, all those voices withdrew. No one volunteered. In the corridors of the palace, only whispers now moved about. If the king was to live, who would go in his place? This very question began to gnaw at Admetus's honor as well. Because listening to the silence of others for the sake of his own life, even if it was not as heavy as dying outright, carried a different kind of humiliation. From that moment on, Admetus began to shrink in his own eyes, not only as a man who feared death, but as a ruler forced to place the price of his life upon someone else's shoulders. Alcestis watched all of this unfold not from a distance, but from the very center of the palace. Each time her husband returned from his mother and father, she saw a little more exhaustion on his face and a little deeper embarrassment. This man, who fell silent beside his children, stood upright before his people in the courtyard, yet fixed his gaze on a single point once he withdrew to his chamber, was no longer only a king. He was a human being whose fear and shame had become entangled. Alcestis clearly saw both his weakness and his helplessness, but what she saw was not only Admetus, she saw her children. She straightened one child's hair, held the other's hands, and thought about how they would grow up in a palace without their father. She thought of the order of Pherae, of the small heirs who would have to cling to the throne, of the days of mourning in which the women and servants would be left adrift. Her decision did not come from a moment of emotion or from romantic devotion alone. Alcestis weighed the matter not only with the feelings of a wife, but with the cool judgment of a mother and a queen. And for that very reason, her silence came not from fear, but from the weight of the decision. Because some people chose their fate not with lofty words, but with the decision they made where no one heard them. At last, when Alcestis told Admetus her decision, she did so not with tears, but with clear dignity. She said that she accepted dying in her husband's place because his survival meant not only the life of one man, but the life of her children's father, the ruler of Pherae and the pillar of the household. At first, this struck Admetus like deliverance. Then it immediately turned into a deeper pain, because the answer he had been waiting for had come, but the one who gave it was the person he could least endure losing. Alcestis's sacrifice was not an ordinary act of consent. She knowingly gave up her youth, the years in which she would have continued to see the sun, and her right to watch her children grow up from close at hand. When Admetus took his wife's hands, gratitude and shame became entangled. Life now seemed possible again, but that life had lost its former innocence. Alcestis read the breaking in his eyes and remained calm so that he would not take back this decision. Because once these words had been spoken, they echoed through the walls of the palace not only as sacrifice, but as a judgment that would never be erased. From that day on, the palace of Pherae continued to stand on the surface, but inside the meaning of everything had changed. The servants walked more quietly, the joy in the courtyards lasted for a shorter time, and even the children's games were sometimes cut short by an unexpected silence. Alcestis did not turn back from her decision. On the contrary, she transformed the approaching end not into panic, but into an orderly acceptance. Yet Admetus, though he had regained his life, did not feel saved. Each day the sun that rose for him began to seem like time being taken away from Alcestis. When the refusal of his mother and father, the silence of his friends, and the acceptance of his wife all came together, the truth became clear. A person loved his own life most of all. Within that law, what was noble was not denying it, but being able to give up that love for someone else. Alcestis had done exactly that. Walking through the palace gardens with a divided soul, Admetus was no longer only someone who had escaped death. He was the man who had allowed the woman he loved to walk into darkness for his sake. And so, the true tragedy of the story was completed. The exchange had been found, but over the life that had been saved, a shadow had fallen so heavy that no victory could ever lighten it. After Alcestis announced her decision, nothing in the palace of Pherae looked the same anymore. But what truly changed was not the stone walls, but the meaning of the silence that echoed within them. The footsteps that had once passed through those same corridors carrying the order of daily life were now heard as if each sound were a sign of the approaching separation. Even so, Alcestis did not behave like someone overcome by fear. She neither cried out nor adorned her decision with grand words. Her strength revealed itself precisely there. Even as death drew near, she preserved a dignity that did not disturb the order of the palace, that did not make her lose herself in front of her children, and that, even when she saw the helplessness on her husband's face, tried not to unravel him any further. From the outside, that bearing looked like unshakable composure, but within that dignity lay all the fragility of the human heart. Alcestis wanted to live. It was not easy to leave behind the sun, the voices of her children, and the mournings of Pherae. Yet she had made her decision without leaving herself any path back, because in her eyes the matter was no longer only her own life, but the wholeness of the household that would remain behind. Thus the palace turned from a living home into a sacred place, preparing for the heavy ceremony of an approaching farewell. As the final day drew near, Alcestis began to prepare her body and soul for this parting. As the sources described, she performed her sacred washing, arranged her hair, put on her plain but clean garments, and prepared herself not like a bride, nor like one in mourning, but like a queen going forth to her final duty. In those moments, the calm on her face shook the people of the palace even more, because people often understood pain that cried out, but grasped the magnitude of pain carried in silence only much later. That was why Alcestis's bearing became unforgettable. She did not move like someone who fell apart the moment death was spoken of, but like someone who had decided to stand before fate with her head uncovered. Her preparation did not mean only that she accepted her own end. It also meant that she gave order one last time to everything that would remain behind. She had thought of everything a mother, a wife, and a queen needed to think of, in whatever order those duties demanded. That was why her steps, though slow, carried no hesitation. For Alcestis, time had ceased to be a space in which fear could linger, and had become a sacred trust, each minute of it to be used with care. One of the deepest moments of this preparation took place before the altar of Hestia, guardian of the hearth and household. When Alcestis came before the altar, she knew she had not come there for an ordinary daily prayer, but to bow there for the last time in her life. When she knelt, her voice did not tremble, but because her words rose from a mother's heart, each syllable carried a grave warmth. She did not pray for her own salvation. She pleaded for the children who would remain behind. She prayed that they would not be left alone too soon, and that they would endure the loss of their mother, not only through pain, but under the shelter of divine protection. She asked for a noble future for her son and an honorable life for her daughter. She begged the goddess that the absence falling to her children's share would not become the whole of their fate. This prayer was not only a mother's prayer, it was also the final ordering made by a queen whose absence was drawing near, so that the household might still stand after her. In that moment, Alcestis spoke not as the lady of the palace of Pherae, but as the last watchkeeper about to depart from the house. This quiet supplication before the altar of Hestia turned her death into not only a sacrifice, but a conscious decision made with the future of those left behind fully in mind. After completing her prayer, she went through the sacred corners of the palace one by one. She stopped briefly at each altar, bowed her head before each one, and gently withdrew herself from the divine order of the house in which she had lived. From the outside, this walk might have looked like an ordinary farewell, but in truth it carried the step-by-step departure of a person from her own life. Before each altar, Alcestis came face to face with the invisible traces of the years she had spent in that home. The day she first held her children in her arms, the joys she had shared with Admetus, the cheerful days of the palace, and its quiet evenings, all followed after her like memories. Yet she did not let them become obstacles to her, because the time had come not to cling to memories, but to leave them properly behind her. Her face did not fade throughout this passage, and that shook those around her even more. The more the servants expected her to collapse, the calmer Alcestis appeared. There was no heroic display in that calm. There was only the will to carry a chosen burden before the eyes of others, without making it heavier for them. Thus the stones of the palace etched her final passing before them into their memory like a ceremony, and with every step Alcestis moved a little farther away from the living home she had known. But this unshakable order began to crack when she reached the threshold of her own chamber. For no matter how dignified a person might remain before the gods, before her children, and before her people, she could not preserve the same composure when bidding farewell to the most intimate part of her life. When Alcestis looked at the bed she had shared with Admetus, that room where she had once imagined they would grow old together, the possibility that another woman might come there after her stood before her for the first time, as if it had taken on flesh and bone. In that moment, the pain that humanized her sacrifice came fully into view. Alcestis was not only a wife who was dying, she was also a woman wounded by the thought that the place of the love she left behind might one day be filled. She tried to enter and leave the room several times, but the memories called her back to the same place each time. She touched the bed, looked at the walls, and tried to feel one last time the warmth of the life they had built there together. This scene did not weaken her decision, but it laid bare how costly that decision truly was. Death was no longer an abstract fate. It had become a real separation settling itself among the objects she touched and the days they had shared. Her children could not fully understand this change in their mother, but they sensed the grief moving through the house and clung to her more often. When Alcestis called them to her, she spoke not like a queen, but simply as their mother. She took each of them into her arms one by one, looked at their faces for a long time, and did not let go of any of them in haste. As the sources told it, this moment was one of the heaviest centers of her sacrifice, because the true cost of what she had accepted in order to keep her husband alive was that she would not even be able to watch her children grow from afar. As she entrusted them to Admetus, she did not ask only for a father's affection. She asked him to bear together both the burden of fatherhood and of motherhood. She wanted her children to be raised not without love, but under a protection that lacked nothing. That was why she did not ask Admetus merely not to weep or to stand strong. She asked him for a far harsher, far more concrete oath. She demanded that after her, no harsh or jealous stepmother be brought over her children, and that their motherlessness not be deepened by a second wound. This request showed that even on her deathbed, Alcestis looked not only at feeling, but at the future of the household, And as Admetus gave that oath, he felt once more with all his heart the weight of the life that had been spared for him. As the people of the palace watched Alcestis's farewell, they understood her greatness most clearly in those final hours. From the oldest servant to the youngest guard, each one saw before them not only the wife of their ruler, but a lady who had cared for each of them in her own way and had carried her household with great care. Alcestis approached each of them one by one, without regard for rank, looked into their eyes, and said farewell. This act did not diminish her nobility, even at the threshold of approaching death. On the contrary, it made that nobility even more visible. For true greatness showed itself not only while seated on a throne, but also in whom one remembered while departing. As Admetus watched all these farewells, he sank ever deeper into guilt. He could no longer deny that for the sake of his own life, the heart of the palace had been torn out. For a moment, he wanted to tell Alcestis to take back her decision, but he also knew that in the midst of so much pain, that would give rise only to a new helplessness. Alcestis, however, understood his gaze, and once again, it was she who became the one who comforted him. Though she was the one whose death was approaching, she was still the one who calmed Admetus, kept the farewell in order, and tried already to bring order to the emptiness those left behind would have to bear. When the final moment came, Alcestis's voice no longer held its former strength, but her mind was still clear. Admetus held her, tried not to let her go, and could not stop the protest rising inside him. Alcestis, in his arms, did not need to declare her decision again, but left behind only a few calm words that accepted the truth. She did not deny how sweet life was, but she also knew that the one who went on the road of the dead did not return. While the sun kept rising over Pherae, light had become for Alcestis a blessing now left behind. In that moment, everyone in the palace felt that an age had ended, because this was not only the death of a woman, but the irreversible moment that determined the course of a household, the conscience of a king, and all the meaning that followed in the story. Alcestis carried her own decision to the end with a quiet but unshakable will, without turning it into a display of heroism. And so, for the first time, the palace of Pherae understood that a life saved did not always bring joy. Sometimes the preservation of one life left behind a heavier silence, one that would fall upon the shoulders of everyone who remained for years. When Alcestis's last breath left the room, no cry in the palace of Pherae fully matched the weight of that moment, because some losses were felt not through sound, but through a void that suddenly changed the meaning of everything. As Admetus held his wife in his arms, he felt not only the woman he loved, but also the cost of his own salvation. The body that had leaned against his shoulder only moments before had now been drawn into a silence that would not return, and for the first time the king saw with complete clarity that being allowed to go on living was not a blessing, but a burden that was hard to bear. The calm on Alcestis's face shook the people of the palace even more deeply, because that peace did not resemble the rest that came after a struggle that had been endured. It resembled a heavy responsibility left behind for those who remained. The children did not fully understand what had happened, but they sensed the change in the air in the room and huddled close to one another in fear. The servants lowered their heads, the women dropped their eyes to the floor, and the brightest household in Pherae suddenly turned into the threshold of a silent tomb that kept its light hidden within itself. Admetus's grief was not only the grief of losing love. Shame had also mingled with his tears, because while he wept as a husband who had lost Alcestis, he also stood before his own conscience as the man who had gone on living in her place. One by one, he remembered his wife's words, her plea for their children, and the heavy promise she had torn from him that no other woman would ever be brought to her bed. In that moment, all the days of the future lay open before him, yet each of them seemed stained by a piece taken from Alcestis. When the king looked at the walls of the palace, the stones of the courtyard, and the rooms they had walked through together, he understood that everything would now carry two meanings. One was the warmth of the life they had shared in the past, and the other was the knowledge that that warmth had been extinguished for the sake of his life. That was why his cry was directed not only at separation, but also at the life that had fallen to his share. It was painful for a person to lose what he loved most, but when that beloved thing had gone in his place, the pain also carried an indelible guilt within it. As the news spread beyond the palace, the people of Pherae quietly gathered at the gates in the courtyards and near the stone steps. The people had known their queen not only for her beauty, but for the calm she brought to the household, her gentle yet steady manner, and the measured closeness she showed to people of every rank. That was why the crowd that formed before the palace was not a crowd of curiosity, but a true crowd of mourning. No one spoke loudly, and everyone carried the scale of the disaster that had befallen them less in words than in the dull expression on each face. Even within his grief, Admetus had to go on being king, and he ordered that not an ordinary burial, but funeral rites worthy of Alcestis' sacrifice be prepared for her. The horses would be made ready, the offerings would be arranged, and unlike the joyful ceremonies Thessaly had long been used to seeing, the whole city would now be marked by signs of mourning. Yet no matter how grand the ceremony that had been prepared was, everyone in the palace felt the same thing. No rite would have been enough to send off the true lady of that house in a way that was complete. As the day went on, mourning settled not only into the rooms, but into the rhythm of the city itself. Cheerful melodies fell silent, even the sounds of preparing the tables grew hushed, and everyone who entered or left through the doors tried not to rise above a whisper when speaking. At one point, when Admetus looked from inside the palace toward the outside, he saw that Pherae shared in his grief. That sight did not comfort him. On the contrary, it made even clearer how great a void Alcestis would leave behind. Because her death was not only the loss of a wife, but the withdrawal of a presence that had stood at the center of the whole household. The king asked himself how he would keep living after such a woman, and none of the answers he gave himself brought him peace. Even so, he made one decision. Alcestis' name would not fade into the shadow of a forgotten mourning. Her memory would live within the palace, not as a wound of guilt, but as a measure of loyalty known by all. Yet even that resolve did not lessen the bare truth created by the silent body lying in the room at that moment. Life had to continue, but it could no longer continue in its former order. Just in the midst of those heavy preparations, the sound of an entirely different world approached the palace gates. Strong footsteps from afar, a loud breath, and a vitality that did not fade even through the weariness of the road did not fit the atmosphere of Pherae that day in any way. The one who came was Heracles, the great hero who stopped at the house of his friend while passing through, and who, though he carried the weight of a new labor on his shoulders, still held within his presence the overflow of motion and strength. As he approached the palace, he did not know all the details of the mourning that had fallen over it. Trusting in an old friendship, he came to the gate, assumed he would be received, and wished to enter not like a stranger, but like one who possessed the right of a guest. When Admetos saw him, something inside him split in two again. On one side stood the dead silence that still remained beside Alcestis, and on the other stood the law of hospitality, which Apollo had taught him long ago, and which had become one of the foundation stones of his character. For that reason, Heracles' arrival was not merely a visit, it became a second moment of fate, testing Admetos' virtue within his mourning once again. If Admetos turned his friend away in that moment, he would have remained faithful to his own grief, but if he did that, he would also have broken the law of hospitality that he had counted as honor all his life. If he welcomed him inside, then he would be forced to open his table to a guest, while the shadow of Alcestis' death still had not lifted from the palace. The king made his decision in a brief instant, and chose the path that would weigh down his own heart even more. He told Heracles that he could stay in the palace, but he did not place the true scale of the mourning plainly before him. He did not hide that there had been a death in the house, but he also did not immediately say that the dead person was Alcestis, the center of his own life. He spoke as though someone not far removed from the household was being mourned. That half-truth came not so much from Admetos' weakness as from a principle to which he was so deeply bound that he could not turn his friend away from the gate. He did not want to place his own grief upon the shoulders of his guest, and rather than send Heracles back onto the road bearing such a heavy piece of news, he chose to hold the pain within himself a while longer. In that way, the palace of Pherae became at the same time both a house of mourning and a household that received a guest. When Heracles was brought inside, the people of the palace received that decision in silence, but with astonishment. Because inside, the women were making preparations for mourning, the servants were hurrying about for the funeral arrangements. The fear of the children still wandered through the corridors, and yet the guest rooms were being opened for a visitor. Admetos gave everyone their orders. No one would behave rudely toward the guest, and the duties of hosting would continue without disturbing the order of the house. Everyone obeyed that command, but some of the palace's older servants felt a hard anger inside them, like stone. In their eyes, it was an unbearable contradiction that a guest should be met with wine and food, while the queen had not yet been carried from the house and the mourning was still fresh. Even so, just as Alcestis' house had never let its order collapse during her life, it would not fall apart at the first blow after her death. Everyone worked quietly, as though each wished to act in a way worthy of her memory. And so, on one side of the palace, the dark seriousness prepared for the funeral moved forward, while on the other, the measured order kept for the guest moved beside it, and that division turned the crack inside Admetos into the outer world itself. At first, Heracles took the heaviness on his friend's face for the weariness of the road, and the silence in the house for nothing more than the ordinary gravity of a noble household. True to his vigorous nature, he intended to rest, eat, and prepare for his next journey. Yet there was something strange in the atmosphere of the palace. The hands that served were faultless, but joyless. The doors opened and closed, yet nowhere did any true feeling of ease appear. And Admetos, so that he would not fail in his duty to his guest, almost sealed his grief inside his own body. Though that conduct looked noble from the outside, it in fact sharpened his pain even more. Because every time Heracles spoke an ordinary word, every time he made a simple request, Admetos had to hear within himself once again the truth that Heracles did not know. Thus, in Pherae, the night turned into a heavy chain of hours in which two separate worlds moved beneath the same roof without touching one another. On one side, a house darkened by sacrifice. On the other, a hero who still knew nothing of it. And it was precisely that contrast that quietly began to open the door to the great reversal that approached. As Heracles tried to leave behind the dust and weariness of his long journey in the room set aside for him, he had not fully understood the strangeness in the air of the palace, yet he had felt it. The food placed before him had not been lacking, and the wine had been served in a manner worthy of a friend's house, but within all that order there had been less vitality than suppressed distress. The hands that served had been flawless, but there had been duty on the faces, not warmth. By nature, Heracles had not been a man who carried sorrow for long. He had been accustomed to easing the weight of life through movement, friendship, and the brief relief provided by the table. For that reason, when he noticed the gloomy face of the old servant standing before him, he did not read him as a silent witness to grief, but as someone who did not know how to host a guest. Under the influence of the wine and his natural exuberance, he began to say that what suited a human being was not to despise life even in dark hours. To him, the tomorrow of mortals had been uncertain. For that reason, a person should not have turned the day in hand completely into poison. But the words spoken that night in the palace of Pherae had sounded as wounding as comfort offered in the wrong place. At first the servant chose silence, for his master's command had been clear. The guest would be received, and the great pain inside the house would not be laid on his shoulders like a burden. The old man had known both Heracles' good intentions and why Admetos had hidden the truth. Even so, every sound of a cup, every light remark, and every cheerful sentence had pressed harder on the ache gathering inside him. The man before him had not been rude or thoughtless by nature. He simply had not known the disaster that had fallen over this house. But sometimes not knowing had produced consequences as painful as knowing. The servant could no longer endure that easy manner on a night when the body of his queen had not yet fully left the house, and the crying of her children had still echoed through the corridors. As Heracles calmly advised, a person should live by thinking about fate, but should not waste the day in hand either. That measured tone had now gone beyond the old man's limit of endurance. In that moment, not only anger rose within him, but also the wounded pride of his loyalty to Alcestis, and he thought that remaining silent would not have meant serving his master, but betraying the mourning of his queen. At last the servant lifted his head and let out the words he had held in for so long, like a door forced open after being held shut. He plainly said that the state they were in suited neither laughter nor an easy feast. He stated that seeing the cut hair, the dark clothing, the heavy steps, and the closed faces in the palace, and still thinking an ordinary day was being lived in, that house could only have suited someone who had come from outside. At first, Heracles was surprised by this outburst. He remembered that his friend Admetos had told him that a woman who could be counted as distant from the household had died, and he said that he had thought the true pillars of the house were still standing. But the pain gathered on the servant's face showed that this explanation could no longer stand. Heracles began to ask his questions one after another. Had a child died, an elderly relative, or someone from the close circle of the palace? As each question moved one step closer to the truth, the air in the room also grew heavier. The servant fell silent for a short time. It was as if the greatness of the name he was about to say had changed the room even before the words left his mouth. Then he revealed the truth in a single blow. He said that the one who had died was Admetos's wife, Alcestis, and that this house was now not only a house of mourning, but the house of a queen who had sacrificed herself for her husband's life. These words stripped away all of Heracles' ease at once. The cup he had held in his hand only moments before now seemed to him not like a sign of friendship, but like blindness extended at the wrong time. In that instant, he understood why Admetos had looked away, why his voice had remained measured while his gaze had grown heavy, and why not one face had truly seemed peaceful, while the whole palace had served flawlessly. More importantly, he realized that his friend had buried his own grief inside himself so as not to turn him away from the door. The shock on Heracles' face quickly gave way to shame, for he had disturbed with cheer not the house of a stranger, but a household mourning one of the most virtuous women in Hellas. The moment he heard the weight of Alcestis' sacrifice, he saw with complete clarity how deeply inappropriate his own comfort had been, and he felt that even sitting in that room no longer suited him. Heracles stood in silence for a while. For a man known for his strength, his battles, and his difficult labors, this silence was unusually heavy. But what shook him most had not been only the death of Alcestis, it had been that Admetos had hidden it from him. Even at the hour when his house had collapsed, his friend had not violated the right of a guest and had made room for him by pushing his grief aside. Heracles now saw the true greatness of that act. A king who had suppressed his own heart so as not to turn away his guest had not been an ordinary host, but a man who had sustained virtue at the cost of pain. This thought awakened not only gratitude in Heracles, but also a sense of debt that should not have been left unanswered. In a way suited to his own nature, he rose with the desire to repay that debt, not with words, but with action. In his world, great kindnesses had required an answer of equal greatness. What Admetos had done could not have been passed over with a few fine words at the table. For that reason, from that moment on, Heracles no longer saw himself as an embarrassed guest, but as the man who had to find a remedy against the darkness that had fallen over his friend's house. When he stepped closer to the servant and asked where Alcestis had been taken, his voice had completely changed now. The easy manner from before had given way to careful, brief, and heavy resolve. The old man said that the tomb had been prepared near the road to Larissa, outside the city, in an area marked by polished stone. When Heracles heard this, the distance between thought and action closed at once in his mind. He had not been a man unfamiliar with the laws of the land of the dead. He had also heard what powers claimed their right at a graveside, and how a sacred boundary formed around a life newly buried. He sensed that someone like Alcestis was still only at the beginning of the road, and that a door might still have been forced before death had carried her fully into the distance. This sense had not been reckless boldness. It had been more the habit of a hero who trusted his own lineage and strength and searched for an opening even where the impossible seemed to stand. To him, the virtue of Admetos had deserved such an attempt, and the sacrifice of Alcestis had not been ordinary enough to be left quietly to the earth and forgotten. For that reason, the moment the place of the tomb was learned, The decision inside Heracles had already been made. He threw the lion skin back over his shoulders, gripped his heavy club, and as he prepared for the journey, the servant carefully watched the change on his face. The guest lightened by wine was no longer there. In his place stood the son of Zeus, who wanted to cleanse a great shame with a great deed. Heracles did not explain at length what he intended to do, because some decisions lost strength when they were put into words. Even so, his intention was clear enough in his eyes. He would go to the tomb, wait at that boundary where death claimed its right, and seek an answer that would not leave what had happened in his friend's house unanswered. This was not a rebellion framed as an open challenge to the gods. It was more a heroic insistence unwilling to accept that sacrifice should be forgotten. When the servant saw his resolve, he felt inside himself, for the first time, a stirring that resembled grief, yet was not entirely grief. For much had been told about the strength of Heracles, but that night, what mattered most for the palace had not been only his strength. It had been that the moment he learned the pain his friend had hidden, he had not drawn back but had chosen instead to walk into that pain. As he went out through the gates of Pherae, he left behind not only the sound of footsteps, but also the echo of a fate that had begun to change. Inside the palace, however, Admetos still did not know whether Heracles had learned the truth. He was still in the middle of mourning, trying to hold upright the collapse within himself amid the arrangements of the funeral and the shattered state of his children. Yet at those same hours, the friend he had kept outside in order to protect his own grief was moving directly toward the center of that grief. This contrast formed one of the deepest knots in the story of Alcestis. One had hidden the truth because of virtue, and the other, because of that same virtue, had decided to place himself in danger. In this way, friendship had ceased to be only the bond of tables once shared, or of better days, and had turned into a form of loyalty that reached all the way to the border of death. As Heracles set out into the night, the sky grew heavier, and the mourning in the city had not yet lifted. But there was no longer any motionless surrender within that darkness. With the hero walking on the road to the tomb, the story had arrived at a new threshold. For just as the sacrifice of Alcestis had been given in silence, the struggle that would answer it was also about to begin with that same silent resolve. When Heracles left the palace of Pherae, night had already settled completely over the plains of Thessaly, and the weight of mourning had seeped from the city's stones all the way to the road that stretched toward the cemetery. He had his heavy club in hand, the lion's hide over his shoulder, and only one thought in his mind. The right of hospitality that Admetos had not withheld from him had been too great to answer with an ordinary word of thanks. For him, the matter had not only been that he had sat in his friend's house with a joy that had not belonged there, it had also been that the noblest being in that house had been laid into the earth for the sake of friendship itself. That was why, as he moved toward the road to Larissa, he did not feel like a hero setting out on an expedition, but like a man going to pay a debt he had already paid too late. The wind had been light along the road, but the night had not been gentle, because around newly sealed graves all the invisible laws of the ancient world had felt heavier. Heracles had known this. Even so, he had not turned back. He had not underestimated the danger of drawing near the boundary of death. He had simply judged that danger worth facing in the presence of Admetos' virtue. When he reached the tomb, it did not look like an ordinary burial place. The scent of fresh earth hung in the air. The silence was denser than the silence inside the city. The moonlight struck the stone and made everything look colder and farther away than it was. The fact that Alcestis had only just been sent off turned this place into something less like a final point where death had been sealed and more like a fragile threshold set between two worlds. Heracles studied the surroundings carefully and chose to wait in the darkness near the tomb rather than remain visible in the open. According to the sources, what he had waited for there had not been a funeral procession or grieving people. What he had waited for had been the dark power that came to claim the dead. Heracles could be an impatient man, but that night his patience became part of his strength. He slowed his breathing, listened to the sounds of the earth and the night, and remained still without taking his hand from his club. In that moment he was no longer only the son of Zeus. He had become a will standing guard at the border between life and nothingness. After time moved heavily forward, the air around the tomb slowly began to change. The wind suddenly turned colder, the night seemed to deepen its own darkness, and a strangeness that could not be seen but could be felt descended over the earth. That was how Heracles understood that the moment he had been waiting for had arrived. In ancient tales, death had often been recognized not by the clash of swords or the roar of thunder, but by the withdrawal of light. The arrival of Thanatos had belonged to that kind of coming. He did not come to the tomb with a battle cry. He drew near more like a silent yet chilling authority, coming to take what he believed belonged to him. Alcestis's life had already been counted as dedicated to him, and because of that, his coming carried not anger, but a cold certainty. But that night, there had been a disruption in the order death had been used to. At the place where he came to take his victim, frightened people were not waiting for him. A hero ready to use his own body as a shield was hiding there instead. When Thanatos came close enough, Heracles suddenly stepped out of the night, and waiting turned into action. Heracles did not make his move with a sword, or with a weapon thrown from a distance. At the side of the tomb, he chose to confront death through the weight of the human body itself. The power before him had not been the kind that could be stopped by words alone or driven back by any ordinary threat. When their struggle began, the area around the grave suddenly changed from a silent burial ground into a sacred trial where the ancient order shook. Thanatos tried to free himself by using his coldness, his power to slip away like a shadow, and his chilling weight, while Heracles met him with a force rooted in the earth itself. His strength had not come only from his muscles. The moral insistence created by the honesty he had witnessed in Admetos's house and by the sacrifice Alcestis had made had also entered the struggle. Heracles did not only want to seize his opponent, he wanted to force him to take back the sentence he had brought. Because of that, he did not loosen his arms, he did not draw back his steps, and no matter how heavy the night became, he continued to resist beside the tomb like a rock. As the struggle dragged on, Heracles saw more clearly that the power of death did not resemble the enemies he had faced on battlefields. Before him, there had not stood a warrior of flesh and bone or armor of steel. There had been, rather, an ancient darkness that chilled whatever it touched, tried to loosen the will and whispered to a person, "Let go." But the very nature of Heracles seemed to have been made in defiance of that command. He had carried the burden of the 12 labors, fought monsters, and moved back and forth between gods and men. Because of that, he did not let fear settle into his body. Every time Thanatos tried to slip free, he tightened his grip again. In Heracles' eyes, this was no longer only a matter of taking back one woman. It had become a matter of refusing to let human loyalty be abandoned to oblivion. Alcestis had gone willingly, yes, but her departure had been too great to dissolve into the earth through blind forgetting. That was exactly why, even when his breath narrowed and weariness spread through his body, he decided within himself that he would not pull back until he tore this silent rite from the hands of death. At last the balance began to shift. That cold certainty Thanatos had spread around the tomb could no longer keep its old strength against Heracles' unshakable resistance. This was not a scene in which death vanished or was humiliated in defeat. It was rather a moment in which it had to accept that the order it was used to had not worked this time. Heracles did not release him until his claim over Alcestis began to come undone. Setting aside the harsher images in the source text, what happened here was this. For the first time, life pressed itself against the gate of death, not only with prayer and tears, but with the full weight of human will. When Thanatos was forced to retreat, the night also stopped looking as sharp as it had only moments before. It was as if the darkness around the tomb opened a hollow within itself, and the line of fate buried in the earth began to open again. In that moment, Heracles did not relax, because he would not accept that the struggle had truly ended until he saw in full what he had won. But a few breaths later, in the middle of the darkness, what appeared was no longer an empty shadow, but the silent weight of a human being. When Alcestis was drawn back from the edge of death, she did not look like someone returning from a feast, or like a bright miracle suddenly filled with joy. She was still silent, still surrounded by the shadow of the underworld, and her return carried not a sense of full completion, but a fragile state of threshold. Heracles held her with great care, because what had been torn away from beneath the earth had not been only a body, but a fate redirected between two worlds. The warmth of life had not yet fully returned to Alcestis, but she no longer belonged to that unreachable distance either. Heracles knew that this was a moment of victory. Even so, he did not shout his triumph. What he had gained at the side of the tomb had been too weighty to carry with noise. As Thanatos withdrew into the shadows, Heracles listened carefully to the silence left behind, and he understood that this silence was no longer the final sound of mourning, but the first sign of return. He had secured the greatest answer he could give his friend, but he also sensed that this could not be carried to the palace at once, exactly as it was, because like everything that came back from the edge of death, Alcestis too had to be held for a sacred interval before she could fully re-enter life. As Heracles left the side of the tomb, he felt on his shoulders not only his weariness, but also the weight of the secret he carried. The one he was bringing back to Pherae was Admetos's lost wife, but she was not yet a queen returned in her former state. She was a being whose silence continued, whose purification had not been completed, and who had only just crossed the thin border between life and death. That was why he did not hurry on the road back. The night was still cold, the stony roads of Thessaly were still quiet, and Heracles' steps were more measured now than they had been when he was walking toward the tomb. A little later, he would stand before his friend, not only with good news, but with a reality that the mind would struggle to accept at first. Between the hour when Admetos left his house of mourning and the hour when he would return, fate had truly changed. Alcestis' sacrifice had not disappeared into the earth, and the loyalty given to her had not gone unanswered. But for this return to reach its final meaning, one more threshold still had to be crossed. Heracles knew this, and because of that, when the gates of Pherae began to appear, he continued on his way, thinking that the miracle he carried had to be presented not with noise, but with care. When Heracles returned to Pherae, the palace still carried the heavy breath of mourning. The stones in the courtyard glowed under the pale light of lamps that had not gone out through the night, and the servants standing watch at the doors looked at every shadow entering and leaving with an attention beyond what had once been ordinary. This time, the hero had not brought only his own imposing presence to the gate. A woman walked beside him as well, her face veiled, utterly silent. Her steps did not falter, yet she did not seem to belong fully to the world of the living. It was as though a fate torn from beneath the earth had been brought back to the palace before the night still clinging to it had fully let go. There was none of Heracles' usual air of overflowing triumph on his face. Instead, he carried the grave calm of men who had completed something immense and did not wish to scatter its weight with light words. When Admetus saw him, he felt glad that his friend had returned safely, but immediately after, his gaze fixed on the veiled stranger and he tensed again. In a house of mourning, any stranger brought in at such an hour and in such silence carried a sign powerful enough to reopen a door of grief that had not yet been sealed. Without waiting for Admetus to ask, Heracles began to speak. He said that on the road he had gained a valuable charge and wished to leave it in his friend's care for a while. He explained that this woman needed protection, that he himself still had another task to complete, and that for this reason he wished to entrust her for a short time to the palace of Pherae. His words were careful. He neither revealed the truth directly nor lied completely. Admetus, however, pulled back from the very first moment. He said that while the lamps burning for Alcestis had not yet gone out, it was impossible for him to bring a veiled woman into his home. He made it clear that this was not only about the warmth of fresh grief, but that he did not wish to break the promise he had made. In her final moments, Alcestis had asked him to protect their children and not bring a harsh stepmother over their heads, and now Admetus was trying to stand upright between that oath and his own conscience. Though Heracles' request seemed friendly, for the king it touched the most wounded place in his heart. As Admetus continued speaking, he voiced his deepest fear more openly. In the sight of the young men of the palace, the servants, and all the people of Pherae, bringing such a woman inside would not merely mean being misunderstood. To him, it would mean casting a shadow over Alcestis' memory with his own hands. He feared that people would whisper, his wife's death was still fresh, and he already put another in her place. But what wore him down most was not the voice of the people, so much as the voice within himself. Because he felt that this veiled stranger would not be only a woman, but a foreign shadow cast into the middle of his mourning. While Alcestis' chamber, the name of his children's mother, and the memories sunk into every stone of the palace were still alive, the crossing of that threshold by another woman seemed like betrayal to Admetus. That was why, as he tried to refuse Heracles' insistence, there was not only hesitation in his voice, but a hardness that nearly resembled fear. He did not want to hurt his friend, but he was also trying to protect the boundary of his own pain, because there were some doors a person closed not to others, but first to himself. Heracles did not dismiss Admetus' resistance as he listened to it. On the contrary, he saw not ordinary stubbornness in his friend's words, but true loyalty, and he openly honored it. He said that the fact Admetus had not scattered his heart so soon after Alcestis showed the depth of his character. But then he added that this loyalty was now being tested in another form. He explained that what he was asking of the king was not a marriage, not closeness, and not the placing of another happiness where grief still stood. He only wanted him to accept someone who needed to be protected, someone who would be entrusted in silence. These words did not fully ease Admetus's anxiety. Still, Heracles' voice was filled less with his usual force than with the patience of a kindness whose meaning he had not yet revealed. When Admetus looked into his friend's eyes, he saw no game there and no lightness. Yet he still drew back, because a person in pain feared most of all the things that looked like hope. It was here that Heracles took one step further and said that he no longer wanted only the woman to be taken into the palace, but wanted Admetus to accept her with his own hand. That request weighed more heavily on Admetus than all the previous insistence. Having the woman taken inside was one thing. Touching her with his own hand was something entirely different. A ruler could open doors by command, have rooms prepared by his servants, and take on the responsibility in a formal way. But to accept her with his own hand meant taking the burden of conscience onto his shoulders as well. Admetus immediately turned his head away and said he could not do it. He suggested that the stranger be entrusted not to him, but to the women of the palace. That way he would neither cast a shadow on his oath nor reject his friend completely. But Heracles did not accept that indirect path. That was precisely what he wanted, for Admetus to approach with his own hand the truth hidden behind the veil. He told his friend that not touching this woman would be the real wrong, that his fear was keeping him from the truth. These words only troubled the king more deeply. There was authority in Heracles' voice, but there was trust as well, and that trust had begun to clash with Admetus's own dark suspicion. At last, though unwillingly, the king turned his head to the other side and slowly extended his right hand. When Admetus's fingers touched the hand of the veiled woman, that touch awakened in him not a single feeling, but many memories colliding with one another. The hand was neither as cold as that of a stranger, nor fully filled with the warmth of ordinary life. It seemed to reach out from within a silence that had returned from the edge of death. For a moment, the king wanted to pull his hand back. That contact recalled to him both the last moment of Alcestis and the closeness he had thought he would never live again. Heracles did not allow his hand to loosen. He gently pushed his friend's wrist forward and made him hold the woman's hand. In that brief instant, Admetus's whole body trembled. Reason told him that such a touch could not be ordinary. Mourning refused to accept such a possibility. The king's breath tightened, his eyes locked on the veil, yet he still did not dare to look. For sometimes a person feared most the miracle he wanted most. At the very moment the possibility of its being real appeared. Heracles saw that fear, and without making his friend wait any longer, led him toward the final curtain of the truth. As the hero reached for the edge of the veil, the air in the courtyard changed again. Without realizing it, the servants held their breath, and even the flames of the lamps seemed to burn more steadily. When Heracles lifted the veil with a slow but resolute motion, the face that appeared before Admetus was the very face for which he had been mourning. Alcestis' features looked paler, quieter, and deeper, as though they had passed through the heavy shadow of death. Yet she was still Alcestis. The moment Admetus saw this, he stepped back. He could neither rush forward at once in joy, nor reject entirely what he saw. His first thought was that this might be a trick of the gods, a vision born from grief, or a deceptive image sent from the world of the dead. For the woman he had committed to the grave was now standing before him, tearing the order to which the mind had grown accustomed from its place in a single instant. Heracles, meanwhile, watched his friend's shock in silence and finally said plainly that what he saw was neither shadow nor illusion. Alcestis had been brought back from the edge of death. And yet the miracle was not complete. When Admetus leaned toward his wife, as though longing to hear her name from her own lips, not a single word came from Alcestis's mouth. Her eyes were open, her gaze carried awareness, and her hand rested in his with the living weight of life itself, but there was no voice. The joy on the king's face was darkened at once by a new anxiety. Then Heracles told his friend that this silence was not a fearful lack. He explained that Alcestis had truly entered the realm of death for a time, and for that reason she was considered devoted to the powers below. Before she could return fully to the order of the living, she had to pass through a period of sacred purification. Her silence until the dawn of the third day was not merely the result of bodily exhaustion, but the necessity of having crossed the threshold of two worlds. This explanation did not completely put Admetus at ease, but it gave him a meaning he could endure. What stood before him now was no longer an unexplainable silence, but a sacred process of return that had yet to be completed. And for that reason, the king learned to receive Alcestis's voicelessness not as a loss, but as the final price of her return. At last, Admetus took his wife into his arms and walked toward the inside of the palace. This walk was not a triumphal procession, because neither had mourning fully ended, nor was the miracle light enough to be reduced to ordinary joy. Heracles remained behind and did not display what he had restored to his friend, like a spoil of victory. As the doors of the palace opened, the servants within watched in reverent awe as the place that had only moments earlier been a house of death now began, step by step, to open again to life. As Admetus carried Alcestis into the most private chamber, he carried at once the moment in which he had lost her, and this incredible hour in which he had found her again. When he looked at his wife's silent face, fear, gratitude, and caution still mingled within him, but beneath them all, real hope outweighed them for the first time. The silence that would last for 3 days was no longer an empty darkness. It was the final threshold required for life to find its place again. And so, the palace of Pherae passed out of the stillness of the tomb into a brighter yet deeper form of waiting, because Alcestis had returned, but with the return of her voice, the miracle of the story had not yet been fully sealed. The miracle Heracles brought did not turn into joy at once within the palace's stone walls, because although Alcestis returned, her return was not an ordinary homecoming. When Admetus took his wife to her chamber, he saw the face of the woman he loved, held her hand and felt her breathing. Even so, at first glance, he understood that this return had not yet fully reached its end. Alcestis's eyes were open, her mind was clear, and her gaze was familiar, but her lips remained closed. It was as if the great silence she saw at the edge of death still kept her voice for a while longer within its shadow. Admetus tried not to live through this silence as if it were a new loss. He kept in mind the sacred period of purification Heracles described and tried to accept his wife's inability to speak not as a deficiency, but as the final step of her return, a step that had not yet ended. Even so, his heart did not calm easily. He had once entrusted her to the grave, and now he held that same woman in his arms again, yet he could not hear her voice. For that reason, the waiting that began in the palace turned less into the end of mourning and more into a deep and careful vigil, as they waited for the miracle to be completed. Throughout the first night, Admetus hardly slept at all. He sat beside Alcestis, watched her breathing, sometimes took her hand between his own, and sometimes simply looked at her face, trying to understand whether this silent presence that returned out of the darkness was truly here. Joy lived within him, but that joy could not stand there bare and untouched. It mixed with shame, gratitude, and a remorse greater than any he had carried in years. At one point, he bent toward his wife and asked her to forgive him for not daring to die in her place. Alcestis did not answer with words. She only moved her hand slowly over her husband's hair. That gesture was as clear as a reply, yet as silent as a wound. In that moment, Admetus searched his wife's eyes for the traces of dark roads. It seemed that the gaze of someone who returned from the threshold of the land of the dead should have carried an unforgettable shadow. But there he saw not terror but clarity, not brokenness but a deep stillness. That was why the first night turned not into a night of grief, but into a sacred night of reckoning, when a man remained alone with his own conscience. The same careful silence continued throughout the rest of the palace. The servants walked even more slowly through the corridors, where they had rushed only a little earlier to prepare for a funeral, because this time something as great as death, yet nothing like death at all, stood within the house. Alcestis had returned, but everyone felt that one more invisible threshold remained before that return could be complete. For that reason, joy was lived not through sound, but through the delicacy of movement. The lamps were lit more gently, the doors were opened and closed more carefully, and even when the children wanted to run to their mother, the adults had to hold them softly and slow them down. Admetus saw the astonishment in their eyes and understood that the feeling inside him was no different. The lady of the palace stood before them once more, yet for a while she still seemed to belong not to the realm of speech, but to the realm of waiting. Outside, the people of Pherae began to speak in whispers about what happened. The news that the queen had returned spread through the city's stone streets, but because the ritual silence within the palace had not yet been broken, that news moved through the city not as a celebration, but as a sacred rumor, mixed with wonder. In this way, the first day turned into a long day of miracle, one that everyone passed with open eyes and lowered voices. When the sun of the second day struck the walls of Pherae, Alcestis still had not spoken a single word. Even so, her silence no longer resembled the coldness of death, but the careful patience of life returning. When her children were brought to her, she recognized them, opened her arms, and gently drew them both to her breast. No sound came from her lips, yet that deep and unmistakable language of motherhood was still there, in the way she touched their hair, in the way she bent toward their faces, and in the softness she showed as she let them go. The same old Alcestis had returned. The children sensed this as well. Perhaps they did not understand why their mother did not speak, but they no longer feared her, and they no longer lived through her silence as absence but as waiting. As Admetus watched this scene, he once again understood with full weight that his wife accepted the road of the dead, not only for him, but for the future of these children as well. The fact that the bond of motherhood had not broken even in the first hours of Alcestis's return made him think that something stronger than love existed, the responsibility a person carried all the way to the threshold of death. And for that very reason, the king saw more clearly that what had been saved was not merely a life, but the center of an entire household. Throughout the second day, Admetus showed a patience that was not forceful but pleading as he tried to break that silence. He sat beside his wife, whispered old memories she loved, and spoke of the meadows of Pherae, the laughter of the children, and the happy days they shared. He even remembered the melodies Apollo once let echo across those fields, and sought refuge in the soothing memory that music carried, because he believed some wounds loosened through melody before they loosened through words. But Alcestis's silence was not the silence of a stubborn illness that a man could overcome through insistence. It resembled the necessary stillness of someone who returned from another order of existence. As Heracles said, someone who touched the border of the underworld had to remain for a while longer within purification before fully returning to the order of the living. Admetus accepted this with his mind, but his heart hoped for something different at every moment. He waited as if his wife's lips would part at the slightest movement, as if she would say his name, as if everything would suddenly return to its former place. Even so, the day passed and no voice came. In this way, the second day ended as a day of deep patience, one in which hope was not denied, yet was not forced into haste. During those 2 days of waiting, a silent but lasting change also settled within Admetus. He was no longer only a king delivered from death. He was a man who saw how far love itself could go for him, and then witnessed that same love being called back even from beneath the earth. The refusal of his mother and father, the willing acceptance of Alcestis, and Heracles' walk to the very boundary of death for the sake of friendship, stripped away his former self piece by piece. For the first time, he understood that the sweetness of life found its true value only in the eyes of someone who stood ready to sacrifice it for another. That was why, as he looked at Alcestis's silent face, he saw her not only as the wife he lost and regained, but also as the mirror of his own failing and the measure of his own salvation. Living no longer meant only breathing or remaining on the throne for him. Living meant changing in a way that deserved this second chance. While everyone in the palace waited for the moment the queen would speak, Admetus also waited in silence for something else to ripen, the completion of this late but real transformation that began within himself. At last, when the first dawn of the third day began to paint the peaks of the Thessalian mountains with a crimson light, the air inside the palace suddenly changed. First, the weight in the room eased. Then the cool, still air that lasted since the night gave way to a softness that almost resembled a spring morning. The moment Admetus noticed this, he straightened and looked at Alcestis's face. First, the distant veil in her eyes lifted, then a very slight movement appeared on her lips. The king held his breath and waited. Then the expected moment came, the moment that carried all the silence of the palace on its shoulders for days. Alcestis turned her head slightly and whispered her husband's name. This was not merely the return of a voice. In that moment for Admetus, death's final and one-way judgment trembled for an instant. The silence broke apart, and life declared itself once more. Alcestis did not describe dark visions, nor did she speak at length about the roads of the underworld. Her first voice was enough as the simplest and strongest sign that she returned to this world. And at the dawn of the third day, the palace of Pherae breathed in the true sense for the first time. After that moment, the story was sealed not only as a tragedy remembered for sacrifice, but as a great myth in which loyalty and friendship left their echo even in the face of death. Alcestis's first words confirmed once more that what she did was not a blind loss, but a conscious and noble devotion. For Admetus, the answer to the question of the sweetest life had now changed completely. The value of living was measured by the value of the love that descended into darkness to protect it. As the king knelt beside his wife, he felt not only gratitude, he also understood that the life that stretched before him could no longer be his old life. The good Heracles did was carved into the memory of the palace, not only as an act of heroism, but as the moment when friendship did not remain silent in the heaviest hour and moved into action. And with that dawn in which she regained her speech, Alcestis ceased to be a shadow that returned from the grave and became once more the lady of Pherae. Thus the secret of the 3 days of silence also reached its end. That silence belonged not to absence, but to the final threshold that placed the return of life into sacred order. And once that threshold was crossed, what remained behind was not only mourning, but a life rebuilt anew. At dawn on the third day, when Alcestis's voice returned, it was not only the sound of a woman speaking again that was heard in the palace of Pherae. For the first time, the heavy weighting that had settled between the stone walls for days also began to loosen. The moment Admetus heard his own name from his wife's lips, he understood that the darkness opened by loss had not closed completely, but it could no longer rule in the same way, because that voice was not simply the voice of a healed body. It was the plainest and most shattering sign of a life that had been pulled back from the edge of death and given back. When the children heard their mother speaking, they approached her not with fear, but with the astonishment of those who felt that an absence they had long been unable to name had finally been filled. The servants lowered their heads, because even though the lady of the house had returned, this return did not resemble ordinary relief. The air inside the palace changed that morning. The silence did not disappear completely, but it was no longer the silence of death. It began to turn into a stillness in which life was being carefully rebuilt. When Alcestis returned, she did not behave like someone who described the threshold she had crossed with grand words. She did not turn the roads of the underworld, the shadows she had seen, or the boundaries she had crossed into an epic. It was as though she knew that if she did, she would lessen the weight of what had happened. Her greatness did not lie in having gone to the edge of death and returned, but in being able to preserve her measure even after coming back from there. She first looked at her children's faces and saw in their small eyes the mark left by fear and longing at the same time. Then she turned her head and looked at Admetus. In her husband's eyes, there was not only the joy of reunion, but also the frozen weight of a shame that had come too late. When Admetus embraced her, it was no longer the desperation of holding on to someone who was about to slip from his hands. It was the instinct to protect a life that had been given back without shaking it. In Alcestis's first words, neither reproach outweighed everything else, nor any sense of superiority that placed her own virtue in the foreground. She carried only a quiet strength that said she had returned, that her home had still been waiting for her, and that she would now step carefully into this life again. For Admetus, that moment was far more than joy. It was also the moment in which his life was truly judged. Hearing his wife's voice again did not return anything to its former ease. On the contrary, it caused him to see every choice he had made in the past more clearly, more harshly and more nakedly. The sacrifice he had expected from his mother and father had ultimately come from his wife. And even that had not been enough. Heracles, for the sake of friendship, had walked all the way to the boundary of the grave and intervened in his life a second time. Thus, Admetus's survival was no longer only the result of his own desire to live, but the result of a heavy price paid by two separate loyalties. After that moment, being king, being the father of his children, or seeing the sun again no longer remained things to rejoice in by themselves. From then on, for him, living meant living without forgetting what had been paid in his name. For that reason, the gratitude he felt before Alcestis did not remain only an emotional overflow. It turned into a silent oath that determined by what measure he would carry his own character from that day forward. The children could not grasp this moral transformation as adults would have, but perhaps for that very reason, they felt the truth of the return in its simplest form. They had first found their mother through the coldness of her absence, and then found her again through the astonishment of a silent miracle. Even if they could not make sense of the suppressed whispers that had drifted through the palace corridors for days, the collapse on their father's face, and the way everyone lowered their voice when they spoke, they knew that one side of the house had been torn from its place. Now, hearing their mother's voice again meant that the severed piece had returned. The youngest approached her timidly. Another placed a hand on her knee, and another chose to look from a slight distance, as though afraid of losing her again. Alcestis answered each of them without haste and with great care. In the way she touched their hair, took their faces between her hands and called them near. The people of the palace saw something else more clearly. It was not only a body that had been brought back. The order of the house, the children's sense of safety, and the invisible center necessary to keep the future from falling apart had also returned with her. As Heracles watched all this, he did not behave like someone trying to enlarge what he had done. He did not turn Alcestis's return into a display of heroism because he knew that it was not an act light enough to be claimed in a loud voice. When Admetus expressed his gratitude to him, Heracles did not answer with grand words. He stood with a plain dignity that made it clear he could not accept that the virtue he had seen in his friend's house should go unanswered. Yet everyone in the palace saw what kind of greatness stood behind that simplicity, because Heracles had not only been a strong man who went to the edge of the grave. The moment he learned of the pain his friend had hidden, he was the one who chose to walk into the very center of that pain instead of stepping away from it. Many people might have chosen to withdraw from a house of mourning and leave, thinking they had come at the wrong time. He did the opposite and corrected shame through action. For that reason, in Pherae, his name would now be remembered not only for strength, but for a loyalty that had not retreated, even in its heaviest test. What remained in the palace after he left was not the fame of his physical power, but the measure of his friendship. The news that the queen's voice had returned did not remain within the palace walls for long. It first spread to the courtyard through the whispers of the servants, then spilled through the gates and reached the streets of Pherae. Only a few days earlier, that same city had fallen silent for Alcestis's departure, cut the manes of its horses, stopped its songs, and carried the shadow of mourning to the threshold of every house. Now, when those same people heard that their queen was speaking again, they thought that this was not only a family's joy. To them, it was one of those rare moments when gods and heroes touched human fate. The crowd that gathered before the palace did not resemble an ordinary crowd of curiosity. There was as much wonder in their faces as there was joy, and as much reverence as there was wonder. Women embraced one another. The elderly lifted their heads toward the sky, and the young spoke in low voices about how such a thing could have been possible. But no one turned it into a light celebration, because everyone knew that the return of someone who had been entrusted to the earth was too heavy a thing to fit inside an ordinary festival. When Alcestis appeared before her people from the upper part of the palace, the amazement in the square turned into real joy. The eyes that knew they had sent her to the grave now saw that same face again under the sun, and felt clearly that this return could not be explained by human reckoning alone. Even so, the power of that moment did not come from a showy return. Alcestis did not present herself as a miracle. She drew her children close, stood silently beside Admetus, and made visible through her very presence that the house shaken by her absence had been rebuilt. It was at that very moment that the people understood the essence of the story more clearly. This was not only a story of returning from death. It was a story in which a woman's devotion, a friend's courage, and a king's late but real transformation met in the same place. That was why the joy rising in the square carried something greater than the joy of saying, "The queen had returned." At the same time, it became a joy that showed virtue had not gone to waste, that some prices had not fallen into meaninglessness, and that the gods sometimes opened another door in the very place human beings believed to be the darkest. After that day, life in Pherae began to flow again, but nothing remained as thoughtless as before. The tables in the palace were set again. The voices of the children once more multiplied in the corridors, and the servants returned to their daily work. Still, that house now carried a different awareness. Every time Admetus looked at his wife's face, he saw not only the woman he loved, but also the will that had walked into darkness in his place. Alcestis, meanwhile, did not live the life she had regained as though it were the ordinary continuation of a flow that had never been broken. From then on, her presence carried a quiet yet unshakable weight at the center of the house. For that reason, the peace in Pherae was not a light happiness. It was a peace whose price had been known, formed by passing through loss, and therefore carried more carefully. And the story's final judgment lay there. Death had knocked on the door once, love had shown its highest form, friendship had walked to the edge of the grave, and life had returned at the most unexpected moment. Thus, the story of Alcestis was passed down from generation to generation, not only as a sorrowful sacrifice, but as a great myth showing that not even death had been able to erase the meaning of certain loyalties. When Alcestis' story came to an end, what remained was not only a woman who had returned from the edge of death, or a family that had been restored. What remained was a harsh truth that showed who a person truly was in the face of love. Because although this story seemed on the surface to have been about gods, fate, and heroes, at its core it had been shaped by human choices. Apollo had helped, Heracles had intervened, and Alcestis had devoted herself. Yet at the center of all of it had stood Admetus's decision. He had wanted to live, had refused death, and had accepted a sacrifice that would take his place. That was why this narrative had been so powerful, because it had told not of flawless people, but of people who had lived with familiar weaknesses. Alcestis's greatness had emerged precisely there. She had risen in the midst of other people's fear, hesitation, and inadequacy. The most shattering aspect of the story had been the way it showed that love had not always been lived equally. Alcestis had loved, but her love had not remained only in words and had walked all the way to the edge of her life. Admetus had also loved, yet when his love had come face to face with death, it had not maintained that same height. The disturbing power of the myth had arisen exactly from that difference, because everyone who had read or listened had inevitably been left alone with the same question. How far would we truly have gone for the people we said we loved? And the harder question was this: how far would we have silently allowed them to go for us? The story had not drawn a simple line between good and evil. It had made visible the imbalance within love, the difference between gratitude and burden, and the thin line between sacrifice and habit. But this narrative had not been merely a text of accusation. If it had been, then in the end all that would have remained would have been a harsh judgment directed at Admetus. Yet the myth had said something deeper than that. A person could have been incomplete in the first moment and still could have changed. Admetus had not been great at the beginning. He had been afraid, had clung to life, and had placed his own survival first. But the story had not frozen him in that state. Alcestis's absence, Heracles' friendship, and the shock of her return had started an awakening in him, even if it had come late. And here one of the myth's important lessons had emerged. A person's first reaction did not have to be that person's final truth. Cowardice could sometimes have been a moment, selfishness sometimes a shadow, inadequacy sometimes a beginning. What mattered was whether a person could look into that mirror and truly see themselves. Admetus's worth had not rested in never falling. It had rested in being able to understand what he had become after he had fallen. That was why Alcestis's story had not been far removed from today. People might no longer have bargained with the god of death, but they still had carried one another's lives in quiet ways. Even today, a mother had pushed her own exhaustion into the background for the sake of her child's peace. A spouse had continually postponed personal desires so that a shared life could remain standing. A friend had become the one who stayed behind when everyone else had scattered. A sibling had paid for another person's mistakes with the order of their own life. Modern sacrifices had no longer been lived in epic sentences, but within ordinary days, in hospital corridors, in kitchens, in evenings when people had collapsed in exhaustion after work, and in the small decisions no one had applauded. That was why Alcestis had not been merely an ancient figure. She had been a truth that still lived in our lives under different names. Perhaps the story's most important warning for the modern day had begun there. Unseen labor had been the labor most easily forgotten. People had learned to express love with grand words, but most of the time they had failed to notice who had stayed awake for them, who had given up part of their own share, and who had been forced to keep looking strong. Yet a home had often held together because of one person's silent patience. A child had sometimes grown up in peace because of the fears an adult had hidden. Many lives that had appeared orderly from the outside had remained standing because someone inside had constantly stepped back. The myth of Alcestis had told this truth through great symbols like death and return. Modern life had carried the same truth in quieter, more ordinary but longer-lasting forms. For that reason, the most honest sentence of this epilogue had been this: there might have been an Alcestis in all of our lives, and most of the time we had understood it only far too late. But what the story had taught had not been only to recognize sacrifice, it had also taught not to exploit it. Just because someone's love had been deep did not make it love to leave the whole burden to them. Just because someone's patience had been wide did not make it virtue to test them constantly. A person's silence had not meant they had not been suffering. Alcestis's tragedy had partly lain there. She had seemed so strong, so determined, and so noble that the people around her had almost begun to accept what she gave as something natural. Yet no great sacrifice should ever have been treated as normal simply because someone had been capable of making it. This had also been one of the greatest moral dangers in relationships today. The most durable person had been expected to carry more. The most understanding person had been expected to forgive more. The most loving person had been expected to give up more. Then everyone had thought that this was simply who that person was. But being strong had not meant being condemned to carry the burden. While Alcestis's story had praised the greatness of love, it had also revealed the danger of turning another person's love into a habit for the sake of our own comfort. That was also why Heracles' place in this story had been important. At first, he had not known the truth. He had sat at the table at the wrong time and had realized the household's grief too late. But when he had learned the truth, he had not taken refuge in excuses, had not used his shame as a pretext, and had not withdrawn by saying, "I did not know." Instead, he had acted. That had been a separate lesson for the modern day, because not everyone had been able to notice everything in time. Sometimes we had realized too late how tired a friend had been, how quietly a loved one had been collapsing, or how a person's silence had really been a cry for help. But realizing something late had not always meant arriving too late. If recognition had joined with courage, life still could have changed. Heracles' true importance had not rested only in his strength, but in his ability to take responsibility the moment he had learned the truth. That was why the story had taught us not only to notice early, but also to rise honestly, even if we had already been late. In the end, the myth of Alcestis had brought us to the understanding that love had been more than a feeling. Love had not been merely longing, attachment, or fear of loss. Love had been noticing what the other person had carried for us. It had been not underestimating their silence. It had been not taking their presence for granted. It had been not leaving their burden invisible. And most importantly, it had been not waiting until absence arrived to understand their worth. Because some losses had been repaired, some silences had returned, and some miracles had offered a second chance. But real life had not often been as generous as myths. Once some voices had fallen silent, they had not been heard again. Once some people had grown tired and withdrawn, it had not been possible to find them again as they once had been. That was why the real lesson had begun after Alcestis' story had ended. What remained in our hands had not been admiration for a miracle, but a question. How had we truly looked at the people in our lives who had kept us standing, who had carried burdens in our place, and who had shown their love not through grand words, but through quiet labor? It had not been enough merely to love them. We had needed to see them. It had not been enough merely to feel gratitude. We had needed to share the burden. It had not been enough merely to understand after losing them. we had needed to learn to understand in time. That was why Alcestis' story had lived on for centuries, because it had told us far more than the story of a woman who had returned from death. It had told us the value of unseen sacrifice, the weight of a conscience that awakened late, and the fact that love had also been a moral responsibility. I hope that as you end your day, this ancient epic has been a good story for you. I look forward to your comments and requests. Do not forget to follow my channel. May the darkness of the night and the rhythm of the sea bring you peace. Until we meet again in another legend, in the breath of another hero. Love.